Good afternoon. I'm Chris Lee, I'm Legislative Analyst with CSAC, and today we're having the second half of our two-part series on the 2017 Housing Affordability Package. So as you recall, last week we discussed new opportunities for counties to pursue funding for the development of affordable homes. If you recall the debate from last year, you'll recall that the governor had conditioned his support for additional general fund revenue for the development of subsidized affordable housing on the approval of permit streamlining and other reforms designed to expedite the development of new housing. So today we're going to talk about the reform side of the 2017 housing package, including some important provisions that counties should be aware of that are going to be effective in January 2018. So today we're lucky to have with us Eric Phillips, who's an attorney with Goldfarb and Littman. He works on housing, land use, and other municipal law issues, and prior to his work at Goldfarb and Littman, he was a planning consultant, so he has that additional level of on-the-ground expertise as related to housing planning and all of the topics that we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, I'll kick it over to Eric to begin the presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks, Jeff, for the introductions. So as Chris mentioned, during the last legislative session, there were significant changes that were made in connection with the housing package that affect the processing of housing applications. So starting January 1st, 2018, a package of bills related to the Housing Accountability Act, the No Net Loss Statute, and SB 35 will affect, I'd say, day-to-day operations and processing of housing applications that come into county planning departments. So I'm going to spend the bulk of my time this afternoon talking about those three suites of legislation and what their impacts are for counties. With the time that I have left, I will talk about some additional tools that have been added, the return of rental inclusionary requirements. I do want to highlight the changes in the housing element annual report requirements that will be effective going forward, as well as highlight some of the changes in analysis that will have to be performed for the next housing element update cycle, even though that is just a few years away. And then very quickly, I'll go through some special districts, some new terms related to regulatory agreements and use restrictions, and accessory dwelling units. But I do want to hit those topics quickly so that we have time for your questions. If anyone needs more information on any of these topics, I would direct you to our website, Goldfarb and Littman. We have a full analysis, I'll hold it up for the camera briefly, available on our website of each of these that go into much more detail than I'll be able to cover in the time that we have today. But let's start by focusing on as I mentioned, the changes in processing housing applications. And the Housing Accountability Act will affect every project that is a housing development project that it comes through the county. And there's specific time frame requirements and findings that are associated for those housing development projects. And I want to highlight those in detail because, again, they will affect all housing development projects that are applied for within the counties. The next area that I want to talk about is the No Net Loss Statute, and this applies to any project that's applied for on a housing element site. And if a county approves a project that has fewer units and at a lower income level than was, or a different income level than was shown on a housing element site, again, specific findings will be required. And then finally, we'll spend some time talking about SB 35. Even though this was the focus of a lot of the discussion and certainly in the popular media, SB 35 got most of the coverage. But we're going to cover it last because even though it is powerful and important, it actually has somewhat of a limited scope and will affect fewer projects than the Housing Accountability Act and the No Net Loss statutes that I'm going to talk about. So diving into the Housing Accountability Act, you'll see anything that's new from this legislative session, I've highlighted with red and underlined. The black text is text that is part of current law. So even today, the Housing Accountability Act applies to all housing development projects, and that includes residences, transitional and supportive housing, and mixed-use projects. And mixed-use projects are now defined so that it's clear that that includes anything that has at least 2/3 of its floor space designated for residential use. And importantly, this applies to both affordable and market rate projects. Sometimes folks forget that market rate projects are also covered by the Housing Accountability Act, so I just wanted to highlight that to make sure that everyone was on the same page. But what the Housing Accountability Act says is that if a housing development project complies with all of the county's objective standards, then the county can only reduce the density or deny that project if it makes specific findings. It has to find that there's a specific adverse impact to public health and safety from the project, and that impact can't be mitigated in any other way. And the standards that the county can look to are the general plan zoning and subdivision requirements that were in effect at the time the application was deemed complete. So in order to make the finding that a project has a specific adverse impact, the impact has to be significant, quantifiable, direct, and unavoidable, and it has to be based on written public health and safety standards that existed on the date the project was deemed complete. So this is actually a very difficult finding for a public agency to make, which really underscores the point that if a project complies with objective standards, it's then difficult to deny or reduce its density. There's an additional layer of protection for projects that qualify for as an affordable project under the Housing Accountability Act. That includes all emergency shelters, projects that have 20% or more of their units reserved for low-income households, or projects that reserve 100% of their units for moderate-income households. And for those classes of projects, then the county would have to make specific findings to deny or reduce the density, or even add a condition that would make the project unfeasible. But those haven't changed. They're the same that they are in the current law, so I'm not going to go through those standards today. What I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about, though, are what constitutes an objective standard. So the Housing Accountability Act doesn't have a definition of objective standards, but case law has interpreted that and given some guidance to us on what that means. The leading case in this area is this Honcharu versus County of Stanislaus case. And there, the court said that, again, if the county wanted to deny a project or reduce its density, it had to first identify all objective standards that the project did not comply with. And if the project did comply with those objective standards, it could only deny it by making the public health and safety finding that I just described. An objective standard, according to the Honcharu court, are things such as height, setback, lot coverage, open space percentage. They can be really specific. It could even include design guidelines that were very prescriptive, such as must include brown shingles or a 30% roof slope. All of those are objective standards that someone can look up and know in advance and easily tell whether or not their project complies. The types of standards that are not objective are findings such as, is the project suitable for its site? Is it consistent with the character of the community? Does it promote the health, safety, and welfare? Those may all be general and valid uses of the police power, but they're not objective for purposes of the Housing Accountability Act, so they can't be used as a basis to deny a project or reduce its density that is otherwise consistent with objective standards. So the big changes that came to the Housing Accountability Act were introduced through these three bills, SB 167, AB 678, and AB 1515. And what it requires is that within either 30 days or 60 days of a project being determined to be complete, and the difference has to do with the size of the project. If it's 150 units or smaller, you have 30 days. If it's larger than that, you have the 60-day time frame. The county has to provide a list of any inconsistencies of any plan, program, policy, ordinance, standard, or requirement that the project is inconsistent with. And if the county doesn't provide that list of inconsistencies with an explanation of why the project doesn't conform with those objective standards, then the project is deemed consistent with those standards, even if it doesn't actually meet those standards. So it's a pretty severe result for not complying with that time frame. So it'll be really important to make sure that counties are able to respond to this consistency analysis requirement in the time frame specified. The other change is that a project can now be deemed consistent if there's substantial evidence in the record that would allow a reasonable person to conclude if it's consistent. And that sounds like very lawyerly language, but it has a very meaningful result on the ground. What that means is that an applicant can now submit their own evidence into the record, and if that evidence is just convincing enough that a court could conclude that a reasonable person would find that that evidence means that the project is consistent with objective standards, then the court can rely on that evidence instead of the evidence that the county itself used. So it's a shift in the amount of deference that a court would usually give. Typically, as long as a county's decision is based on substantial evidence, a court would defer to the county's judgment, especially in interpreting its own regulations, but that's no longer the case. Another change to the standard of review is that county findings now must be based on a preponderance of the evidence if they're going to deny or reduce the density of a project, not just substantial evidence. So what that means is that previously, if there was any evidence in the record to support the county's finding, as long as it wasn't arbitrary, then a court would defer to the county's determination. But under this new preponderance of the evidence standard, there has to be more evidence in the record to support the county's finding than there is that could support the opposite conclusion. So again, it's just a shifting of the standard and an example of how a court will now show less deference to county determinations. And to give that change a little bit of teeth, there are now attorney's fees available to both market rate and affordable developers or advocates who bring lawsuits for affordable or market rate projects. Under current law, attorney's fees are only available under violations of the Housing Accountability Act for affordable projects, but that's now been expanded so that market rate projects can recover attorney's fees as well. In addition, if the county were to lose a Housing Accountability Act lawsuit and be ordered by a court to produce the units or approve the units, if the county were to ignore that court order, it could face fines of up to $10,000 per unit. And if the violation was found to be willful and in bad faith, the court has the ability to multiply that by up to 5 times per unit. So again, very strict penalties for failing to follow the procedures and the requirements set out in the Housing Accountability Act. The next area of law that I'd like to talk about is the no net loss statute. And this is already in the government code. It's section 65863. But SB 166 made a pretty significant change to it that I want to highlight for everybody. So what it says is that anytime a site that's been identified in the housing element inventory is either downzoned or approved at a lower density that was shown in the housing element, then the county has to make specific findings showing that it still has adequate capacity to accommodate its RENA obligation. What SB 166 does in terms of changing that is it adds an additional requirement that says if the site is approved with fewer units at the income level shown in the housing inventory, the county also has to make those findings. So let's look at exactly what that means. This is a hypothetical housing element inventory, and it shows the types of information that you would include in your housing element. It identifies a specific site. It's zoned R3 for residential. It has, say, a unit capacity of 40 units expected on that site, and it's being developed at a density that would allow us to assume that it's for lower income households for purposes of meeting our RENA. If the county were to approve a project that was 40 units of market rate housing, under current law, that would be fine, that complies. But under the changes for SB 166, if it approves 40 units of market rate housing, it has to identify where those 40 units of lower income housing can still be accommodated. And it can do that in a number of ways. In conjunction with approving the project, it has to quantify how much need remains under its RENA allocation and how much capacity it has to meet that need. So again, with that example, the 40 units, if it's being approved at for a market rate project rather than a lower income project, the county would have to find that the remaining sites in its housing element are adequate to meet the RHNA. So maybe there was a surplus of sites that were already available and you can draw down against that surplus, that's fine. The county would alternatively have to show that it approved more units on a different site. Maybe there was a density bonus or a project that applied for more than was being assumed in the housing element. That would give you, again, a little surplus to use if you were approving at a lower unit count or a lower income level. You can find other sites that are zoned appropriately but weren't identified in your housing element. Or if you can't do any of those three things, you have the obligation to identify and make another site available. And what that means is rezone that site to accommodate housing at the density that would allow lower income housing to be developed. And SB 166 specifies that you only have 180 days to accommodate that rezoning. So again, a pretty tight time frame in order to make that site available if it's approved at an income level that's different than shown in the housing element. I also want to highlight the fact that it's solely the county's responsibility to find that alternative site and make the findings required under the no net loss statute. The county is not allowed to deny a project simply because it results in the need for rezoning or identifying additional sites. Again, that puts a lot of burden on counties and public agencies in general. One, at least slightly easier administrative burden is that you're not required to amend your housing element when additional sites are identified. They will have to be disclosed in the annual reports that go to HCD, but you don't necessarily have to do a general plan amendment or a housing element amendment when you're making these alternative sites available. And then the last piece that I want to talk about related to the housing application processing is SB 35. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, this got all of the attention, and I think part of that was because it's such a powerful tool. What SB 35 does is that for projects that qualify to use it, if they're consistent with all of the county's objective standards, then that project is eligible for ministerial approval and on a prescribed time frame that's set forward in the statute. And the real power behind that is for a ministerial approval project, that means that it's exempt from CEQA, because remember, CEQA only attaches to discretionary actions. So for any project that's able to qualify for SB 35, it gets an automatic built-in CEQA exemption. And that's really what leads to the streamlining behind the legislation. However, also, as I mentioned right at the beginning, the reach of SB 35 might be more limited than it sounds on its face, because as you see here on this slide, there's 3 levels of analysis that you have to go through to determine whether or not a project is eligible to use SB 35. And by the time you make it through all 3 of those levels, I think a lot of projects will have been ruled out and not be able to take advantage of SB 35. The first layer of that analysis is determining whether or not the jurisdiction is subject to SB 35. And each CD is charged with making that determination. They have said that they intend to complete that determination as close to January 1, 2018 as they can. So we expect that to be available early in the new year. And what they're going to be looking at when they make that determination is how many building permits by income level have been issued in each jurisdiction. So here is a hypothetical RHNA of 1,000 units. And the typical jurisdiction across California is that 40% of the RHNA is allocated for lower income units, 40% is allocated for above moderate income units, and the remaining 20% is allocated to moderate income units. So what SB 35 does is it looks at that 400 unit allocation of lower income units, and if each jurisdiction is not issuing enough building permits to keep up with that, so 400 building permits for lower income units, then it's going to be subject to SB 35. The way that you become eligible for SB 35 is going to determine then what the affordable housing requirements for SB 35 are. If a jurisdiction is determined to be subject to SB 35 because it's not keeping up with its lower income housing production, then 50% of all projects seeking to use SB 35 have to be reserved for lower income households. So that's a pretty high standard to meet. If a jurisdiction, however, is determined to be subject to SB 35 because it's not keeping up with its above moderate income, so those 400 units of above moderate income, if you're not issuing enough building permits to keep up with that, then only 10% of a project seeking to use SB 35 has to be reserved for lower income households. And if a jurisdiction is subject to SB 35 because it's not keeping up with its lower income and its above moderate income, then an applicant gets to pick whether 50% or 10% of its project is going to be affordable to use SB 35. So it does create a lot of pressure to at least keep up with the above moderate income development and issuance of building permits, because that will then increase the affordability requirements necessary to take advantage of SB 35. The one unanswered question related to this is exactly how HCD is going to be prorating the allocations, because we're just at the beginning of the housing element cycle in many jurisdictions. It's not clear exactly whether they're going to be looking at an annual allocation. So if you're in your third year, did you have to issue 150 building permits? Or a potential reasonable interpretation could be that they're going to look to see if you've issued 50% of your building permits, because they're making their determinations in 4-year increments, so 200 units of lower income housing. Potentially they could also look to see if you've kept up with all 400 units, but they haven't indicated exactly which way they're going to be prorating. But once they do, it will also help us understand which jurisdictions are subject to it and what the affordable housing requirements in those jurisdictions will be. To be eligible to use SB 35, as an initial matter, a developer has to ask for it. The county doesn't have an obligation to review the application and say, look, it looks like you could be eligible for SB 35, we're going to move you onto this streamline track. It has to be invoked by the applicant. And it only can be used for certain types of projects. You have to have 2 or more multifamily units being proposed, and they have to be wholly within the boundaries of an urbanized area or urban cluster as designated by the Census Bureau. They also have to be infill sites, so that 75% of the perimeter of the site has to already be developed. So especially in less developed counties, that will eliminate a certain number of sites even from being eligible to ask for SB 35 processing. The next requirement is that the site has to be zoned or planned for residential use, and it has to be consistent with all objective planning standards that were in place at the time that the application was submitted. And we'll talk a little bit more about what objective means in the SB 35 context, but it's very similar to the conversation that we had when we're talking about the Housing Accountability Act. The last piece is that a project has to meet the affordable housing and labor requirements. I just went through all the affordable housing requirements, the 50% or the 10%, but in addition to that, projects that are proposing 10 or more units have to pay prevailing wages on the project. And if the project is 75 units or more in a coastal or bay county with a population of 225,000 or more, or in a jurisdiction with a population of fewer than 550,000 outside of a coastal or bay county, which is confusing, but basically it's a 75 unit threshold when you parse through all that language. Then those projects have to use a skilled and trained workforce in addition to paying prevailing wage if they want to use SB 35. And the way skilled and trained workforce is defined in the statute basically equates to union labor, and it even lets you use a PLA in order to satisfy that requirement. So the combination of the prevailing wage and the skilled and trained workforce requirements will add another economic disincentive to using SB 35, and I think will limit the application except in areas where there's really high land value or they would have been required to use that anyway because of their funding sources. If you do find a project that invokes SB 35 and is eligible to use it, there's still a number of exclusions that will keep the project from being able to invoke it. The first is that the site must not have contained any housing occupied by tenants within the last 10 years. But you'll remember that to use SB 35, the site has to be zoned or planned for residential use. So you have to have a site that's zoned for residential, but hasn't actually had any residential rental units on it in the last 10 years. What that really will limit it for is areas that maybe were commercial or industrial and have been replanned or redesignated for mixed use or residential redevelopment opportunities, but where that redevelopment hasn't actually happened yet. There's also a long list of exclusions of physical criteria of the individual sites that would keep it from being able to invoke SB 35. Any site that's within the coastal zone is ineligible for SB 35. Prime ag land, certain fire hazard areas, hazardous waste sites, former mobile home parks. I'm not going to go through all of the individual criteria because they're listed pretty precisely in the statute, but I did want to just highlight the fact that there are a number of exclusions that will keep projects from being able to use SB 35. There's also a limitation on the use of a subdivision unless a project commits to paying prevailing wage and satisfies all the labor requirements that I discussed on the previous slide. Regardless of the project size, it's not allowed to use a subdivision. There's also an exception for projects that are being financed by low-income housing tax credits. So we already talked about the CEQA benefit to the applicant that goes along with SB 35, but I also wanted to highlight the fact that there's parking requirements that go along with it too. No more than one space per unit can be required for any project that is able to use SB 35. And in many instances, including if a site is within half a mile of a public transit stop, then no parking can be required to, for an SB 35 project. So the criteria for reducing parking standards all the way down to 0 matches the criteria that was used in the accessory dwelling unit legislation that was adopted last year. And we saw that in many jurisdictions, large areas of their jurisdiction fell within these radii. So I think that if there is an SB 35 project that manages to make it through, there's a good chance that there won't be any parking required for that particular project. The last thing about SB 35 that I want to highlight is the time frame that is associated with it. So the key threshold here, again, has to do with project size. For projects that are 150 units and smaller, you have 60 days. For larger projects, you have 90 days. But the timeline is triggered off of submittal, not off of completeness as it is under the Housing Accountability Act. So it's a more difficult time frame to meet. But within 60 days of submittal, the county is obligated to provide a list of all inconsistencies with the objective zoning and design review standards that were in effect at the time of submittal. And again, just like under the Housing Accountability Act, if you don't submit that letter back to the applicant, then the project is deemed consistent with all of those objective standards, even if it doesn't actually meet those objective standards. The other things I want to highlight about that are that if a development is modifying objective development standards through density bonus, so it can exceed the maximum density or modify development standards such as setbacks, lot coverage, height, if it's doing that through density bonus, then it's still consistent for purposes of SB 35. Again, even if it doesn't actually meet the objective standards. The other little wrinkle related to this is that the general plan is the guiding force, basically. If the general plan and the zoning aren't consistent, then the maximum density permitted under the general plan and the other objective standards that apply in the general plan, if they're inconsistent with the zoning, then the general plan standards apply. So that could be more permissive than the county thought it was enabling if it had more restrictive zoning. The very last thing related to timing here is within 90 to 100 days, again looking at that 150 unit threshold as the dividing line, all public oversight or design review of the housing development has to be complete. So technically you could have a hearing on an SB 35 project. However, it has to be completed within 90 or 180 days, depending on the size of that project. And any hearing or review is prohibited from inhibiting, chilling, or precluding the ministerial approval of a project. So even if it goes before the Planning Commission for SB 35, they're still limited to applying those objective standards and giving the project ministerial approval or denial based on its compliance with those objective standards. So it's not a robust oversight process, and maybe not worth putting before your boards and commissions. But putting it all together, we think that it's really critical for counties to assemble a packet of all their plans, programs, policies, ordinances, etc. that are listed in the Housing Accountability Act, so that you know right up front what objective standards you have to evaluate housing development applications that are coming in. Similarly, we think having a detailed list of eligibility requirements and exclusions for SB 35 will be helpful to determine quickly whether or not a project is able to invoke SB 35 and use those streamlining provisions. Another strategy that counties might be able to do is to review consistency when it's reviewing the completeness of the application. So you can ask the applicant to provide evidence of consistency with all of the plans, programs, etc. that you identified in order to have their application determined to be complete. So you can shift some of that burden off to applicants. And that works under the Housing Accountability Act, but it won't help under SB 35, because remember, SB 35, the timelines are triggered off of submittal, not off of completeness. Related to that, you can, once you've compiled your packet, if you find that you don't have enough objective standards to get the planning results that you want in your community, you can try and create more objective guidelines to use when reviewing projects. And then we also want to remind you to consider CEQA constraints. So under SB 35, there's no CEQA review because it's ministerial. But under the Housing Accountability Act, CEQA still applies. And there's case law that specifically says that nothing in the Housing Accountability Act exempts a project from CEQA. And in fact, an applicant can't even invoke the Housing Accountability Act until CEQA has been completed. So you still have the CEQA process to review and potentially impose mitigation measures if those are necessary for housing development projects under the Housing Accountability Act. With respect to SB 166, we think it will be important to maximize your inclusionary percentages and encourage on-site production of affordable housing so that you are developing an inventory of housing at the income necessary to meet your RHNA. That way you can make SB 166 and no net loss findings if you need to. And potentially that will help with SB 35 compliance as well. Regardless of whether or not a county goes that route and requires additional on-site affordable housing production, we think it's a good idea to review all the projects that are proposed on inventory sites and really keep a detailed log of what's happening on those housing element sites, so you know if you have a surplus or a deficit and when those SB 166 findings will be triggered. Also keep track of sites that are outside of your housing element. If you're developing significant amounts of housing on those sites, especially affordable housing, it can help you with your 166 findings later. The other key tool that you can use to help, especially with the income requirements in SB 166, comes from AB 1505 and the return of rental inclusionary housing. So back in 2009, the Court of Appeal issued a decision, we call it the Palmer decision for short, that said that cities and counties were not allowed to require on-site rental housing as a standard condition of approval. It basically invalidated inclusionary housing requirements as applied to rental housing projects because of the Costa-Hawkins Act. But AB 1505 restores that power and undoes the effect of the Palmer decision. And it says that local governments can now require rental housing to include a percentage of affordable units in connection with that project approval. However, to enforce that, AB 1505 requires that ordinances provide an alternative means of compliance with inclusionary requirements. So what that means is that the county has to offer some alternatives such as paying in lieu fees, land dedication for affordable housing, off-site development of affordable housing units, things like that as an option for the developer if they don't want to provide the on-site affordable housing that you would otherwise require. I will point out that nothing in 1505 requires that those be more attractive than actually providing the on-site unit. So you can have relatively high in lieu fees so that they adequately compensate the county for the cost of providing the affordable housing if the developer opts not to do it on site. And maybe that creates an incentive for the developer to do more on-site production. So to implement it, 1505 says that if you have an existing inclusionary ordinance that was on the books prior to September 15, 2017, then you can begin implementing it right now after January 1, 2018, as long as it meets the standards in 1505. So it has to include an alternative means of compliance. Assuming that it does meet those standards, then no HCD review will be required, no economic feasibility is required, no nexus study is required. Starting day one, January 1, you can begin enforcing that ordinance again. If you don't have an ordinance on the books and need to adopt a new one or make significant amendments to an existing ordinance, you can do so, but an ordinance could be subject to HCD review. And one of the triggers for that is if you're requiring more than 15% of rental units be affordable to low-income housing. So it basically gives you a 15% threshold. And if you exceed that, HCD has the option of asking you to provide an economic feasibility study to show that your inclusionary requirements aren't preventing market rate housing from developing as well. And assuming that you provide that economic feasibility study, then you can continue to enforce your ordinance as drafted. I've mentioned ordinance a couple of times. AB 1505 specifically authorizes inclusionary, but it has to be done by ordinance. It's not enough just to have a general plan policy or a housing element policy. And because of where AB 1505 is codified in the government code, it's in the zoning provisions, we recommend chaptering your local ordinance in with your zoning code, just so that it is a clear use and implementation of AB 1505. The last thing I'll mention about this is that no nexus study is required in order to justify your rental inclusionary requirement. This comes out of that CBIA versus San Jose case that came down 2 years ago about for sale inclusionary housing. It was found that that was a valid use of the police power, and as long as the policies aren't confiscatory, then no nexus study is required. The next area of law that I want to talk about quickly are the changes to the housing elements and annual reports. SB 35 and AB 879 both make changes to the technical requirements that go into annual reporting. Annual reports will continue to be due on April 1st of every year. HCD has indicated that for April 1st, 2018, the next round of reports that are due, the new requirements don't apply. You can continue to use the old forms and fill out the reporting as normal, but through 2018, begin tracking all of this new data that's going to be required because starting April 1, 2019, you'll have new forms from HCD and have to report these additional bits of information that I'm about to talk about. The other thing that AB 879 does is it directs HCD to evaluate the reasonableness of development fees under the Mitigation Fee Act, presumably with the intent of providing justification to the state legislature for restricting those fees, but that report's not due till 2019, so there's no immediate action required for that. Looking at things that you should start tracking right away, to meet the annual report requirements, HCD will be issuing new forms for the annual reporting. They can now do this through guidelines. They don't have to go through a formal rulemaking process, and they're directed to require you to report the number of housing development applications received in a prior year, the number of units that were included in those applications, the number of units that were approved and disapproved as a result of those applications each year, as well as a list of any sites that were rezoned to accommodate your RHNA in connection with your housing element, or that were rezoned in order to accommodate RHNA based on no net loss findings that you made. SB 35 requires a production report that will ask you to report back the number of net new units of housing that have completed entitlements, building permits, and certificates of occupancy. They want to know what income category those units satisfy, as well as the APN where they were developed. And then finally, you'll be required to report back the results of SB 35, any projects that apply and invoke SB 35. You have to disclose what happened to those projects, how many units were developed, and what income level, so that there's some mechanisms for the state to track what effect SB 35 is having on housing production. The next round of changes I'm going to talk about for housing elements are something that we don't have to worry about right away, because the next round of housing elements aren't due for several years, starting with San Diego County down south and working its way north. In short, the new requirements are much more rigorous and require much more analysis of your housing element inventory sites. But what I wanted to highlight, what's effective right now starting January 1st, is that HCD is now specifically authorized to revoke a finding of housing element compliance. And it can review a county's actions or its failure to act that could be inconsistent with its housing element. So if folks are complaining to HCD, HCD has the ability to revoke its finding of compliance on your housing element. It also is specifically authorized to refer those violations to the Attorney General. It doesn't have any new appropriation of funds or staff to HCD, so we're not sure how aggressively they're going to be monitoring this, but certainly if they get complaints, this is a risk that a county could face. When it comes time to do that next round of housing elements, again, as I mentioned, your site inventory is going to be under much more scrutiny. You'll have to demonstrate the realistic development potential of all the sites listed, using both a description of the utilities that are available for those sites, and by showing the density of similar projects at similar affordability levels that have developed in your jurisdiction to justify the unit count that you're allocating to individual sites. There's also what I've been calling a Goldilocks provision about your sites. They can't be too small or too big for housing. They have to be just right in order to include on your housing element inventory. HCD is going to be presuming that sites less than half an acre or greater than 10 acres are inappropriate for affordable housing development and won't let you use that to accommodate your RHNA unless you have specific evidence to rebut that presumption, which could include having a proposed project or approved project actually on that site. There's also much more scrutiny on sites that you've used to satisfy your RHNA in the past. If you have listed a vacant site in 2 or more housing elements, or a non-vacant site in just 1 housing element previously, that site will be presumed inappropriate for lower income housing development to meet your RHNA, again, unless you have specific evidence to rebut that presumption. And then finally, for jurisdictions that rely on 50%, more than 50% of their sites to be non-vacant sites, HCD is going to require substantial evidence that those sites are likely to redevelop for lower income housing during the planning period in order to give you credit for those towards your RHNA. Really quick, and I want to keep a few minutes right at the end for questions, so quick hits. I just wanted to let everyone know there are 4 new economic development tools available. There's funding associated with SB 540 and AB 73 that HCD will be distributing, so you can develop specific plans, zoning overlays, and environmental documents with grants from HCD if you want to streamline affordable housing development. AB 1568 and 1598 are 2 different tax increment tools that can be used to bond against future revenues and use those proceeds to invest in affordable housing development and infrastructure. I also wanted to quickly highlight AB 1521. Under current law, projects that receive governmental assistance have to provide notice when their affordability restrictions are expiring a year before the expiration. That's been extended to 3 years. So in theory, counties will now have more time to plan for how to preserve those units and potentially partner with identify development partners to preserve those units. And then the very last thing I'm going to talk about are accessory dwelling units. Most of the changes in this area happened during the last legislative session in 2016, but during 2017, AB 494 and SB 229 did modify the restrictions somewhat. They broadened the areas where interior ADUs or ADUs that are being developed within existing spaces have to be permitted. They've also restricted the ability to limit tandem parking and parking in setbacks. And I just wanted to highlight that for everyone because local ordinances that don't comply with Government Code Section 65852.2 are preempted, and you're only allowed to enforce state law if you don't have a compliant local ordinance. So it's worth, even though they're minor tweaks, it's worth double checking to make sure that your local ordinance complies with the most current revisions to that area of state law. So with that, I will exhale briefly and see what questions came in and see what we can do about answering them.
Somebody asked early on in the webinar, what counts as a housing project? A tentative map application, building permit application?
Sure, so housing development projects include applications to develop residences, housing, or mixed-use projects. So that can involve something that requires a subdivision application or just a conditional use permit or other planning approvals. The Housing Accountability Act doesn't apply if there's zoning changes or general plan changes that are required. It only applies to adjudicative actions that you're making. Legislative changes, like I said, general plan, zoning changes, or specific plan changes can't invoke the Housing Accountability Act. So those are one area that's carved out.
Somebody else asked, the example involved a subdivision map. So do these laws apply to approval of subdivision maps or just housing development proposals?
So it's correct. The Honcharu case did involve an application that had a subdivision map. So the Housing Accountability Act does apply to subdivisions for residential projects. If it's a commercial subdivision, the Housing Accountability Act doesn't apply. But if a developer is seeking a subdivision approval for residential uses, then it has to be processed in accordance with the Housing Accountability Act. And that means that it can't be denied or have the density reduced unless it conflicts with objective standards, or you can make those public health and safety findings.
Would a housing development apply to an SFD in a zoning district allowing SFD?
Yes, so if an applicant was applying for single-family homes in a district where single-family homes were allowed, then that's squarely the type of situation where the Housing Accountability Act applies. The county at that point would have to review that project application using only its objective standards from the zoning and the general plan for that district to evaluate whether or not that project could go forward.
Those are all the questions that I'm showing here. I think we will thank everyone for attending the webinar. Thanks to both of you for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you.